Joining me today on the Logistics Leadership Podcast, we have Bill Catania of OneRail. So, Bill, great to have you on.
I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
In our industry, I think a bunch of us are familiar with OneRail, but for those who don't know, let's hear from you about what OneRail is all about.
Yeah, so OneRail is focused on last mile fulfillment and specifically last mile and how that interacts with either an e-commerce transaction, a store delivery, fulfill from warehouse. And what we do is we provide an operating system for delivery and fulfillment. We also provide a network of around 12 million drivers that's all managed. So we have a team that manage the exceptions of our deliveries for our customers. So the combination of those three things takes a tremendous amount of friction out of delivery for our customers and kind of gives them almost the Amazon in a box type effect, when coupled with the right upstream capabilities, whether it be in order management or WMS. When you put all that together, put the right nodes together, you can have an Amazon in a box experience.
I love that terminology, Amazon in a box. Well, fulfillment, parcel delivery, that's all of what we're talking about today. And it's been a busy space lately. So I wanted to get back to kind of the genesis of OneRail. I think that was 2018 when you launched. Imagine the thought came about some point prior to that. What sparked this for you? What made you think that it was going to be a successful business? And what got that off the ground for you?
Well, like anybody, right? You have a bad customer experience, and it causes you to start thinking about how you can and maybe have a better customer experience. So, never spent a day of my life in supply chain or logistics. I've had two startups before this. The last one really pioneered the digital coupon space. It was acquired by Inmar back in 2011, and then we sold Inmar. So I don't know, a couple of years after that, I'm buying a refrigerator. It was at a home improvement store, not to be named, and I was told it would take 10 days to get that refrigerator, and it was in the store. It wasn't like we were waiting on to come from the factory. So I instantly started searching for Uber for moving, Uber for delivery. Didn't really find anything at that time, and that set me down a path to build what we launched in 2018, which is an on-demand moving and delivery company. So we started out a lot like some of the platforms that you see out there today, Bungee, GoShare, probably more like Dolly actually, because we did a lot of home moving in addition to delivery. And after doing that, really for a couple years, I started to lean in a little bit into my last experience in building retail enterprise software. And I realized this solution needs, not the solution, but the entire ecosystem of last mile delivery needs to have an operating system. So it was a pivot moment for us. And some entrepreneurs are scared to say the P word. I love it because it means you recognize you have a problem, you are being critical of your solution, and you're doing what you think is right, to maximize the upside where you can actually make an impact. So I realized there's a lot of great solutions out there like Bungee and GoShare and Roadie. At the time, Deliv was out there. I don't need to build another one of those. And what I really need to build is an operating system. I need to build and become a network of networks and work with those couriers that are out there, but not just them. Work with parcel carriers, work with RPCs, work with mom and pops that might have 5 or 10 trucks in a market, and really orchestrate all that capacity. And our pivot was, ironically, it was pretty much this week, back in 2019. So we've really been what you see is OneRail today, for what, 5 years, right? That's about it. So that pivot happened. We raised it. It enabled us to finally raise some seed capital. We had raised a couple million of angel funds at that point, and with the pivot, we picked up an immediate customer, which is American Tire Distributors, which was our first enterprise customer, and then we were kind of off to the races.
Yeah, so I love that we're at 2019 because that was a beyond you. We're coming into a pivot point for the world in terms of COVID. So getting into that space just beforehand, I'd love if you could try to give a brief synopsis of the final mile world over the last 5 years or so. What did it look like? What did COVID change? And what's here to stay?
Um, so if I go back to that moment in time when we had that self-actualization that we needed to pivot, the things that we were seeing were, call it, fragmented supply. So if I'm a courier, I'm working, or if I'm sorry, if I'm a shipper, like a retailer, I'm working with an array of couriers, and it could be 10, it could be 110 to be able to service my last mile needs. And where it became super difficult was this concept that a TMS provides is very static. So if you have a zip code, you have a courier. The couriers are indexed to zip codes. They're not indexed to SLA, speed, location, propensity to be on time, like lost runs. Doesn't look at any of that. So we discovered that TMS solutions were really the dinosaurs of enabling last mile, and a lot of shippers that really wanted to ramp and scale. If you look at Target, right, they bought Grand Junction. There's a reason they bought Grand Junction instead of using a TMS. Companies like Bring and Farai emerged and are great solutions. Delivery Solutions, another good solution, right? So there was a need for something that did more than just match a zip code to a carrier because that doesn't work in last mile.
Right.
So go one step further. Cost containment was a problem. If you're working with 100 couriers, does that mean you have to manage 100 rate cards? The answer is yes. And then the last thing I'll say is visibility. By having fragmented supply, some of which was non-integrated with a lot of these retailers, there's no way to deliver a customer experience that's worth anything. You're not delivering a true customer experience with your brand on it. You're delivering a customer experience that's beholden to the carrier. So
Yeah.
just that's where last mile was by and large pre-COVID. And I got to be honest, I don't think it's terribly much further ahead right now. I think it's
Oh,
definitely made some gains, but if you look at the ecosystem of last mile shippers that are really innovating last mile, it's either retailers that made a significant investment themselves, which again is Target, it's Home Depot, it's Walmart, and of course they're offering it as a service, right?
right.
And then there's companies that have invested in companies like OneRail. Lowe's Home Improvement is our biggest customer. Lowe's made a big investment. They've talked about us in their earnings calls. They're ahead of it, but they had to make an investment and they had to make some decisions. And then there's the ecosystem of companies that made a big move after COVID that realized, that they really needed to put they needed to meet their customer where their customer was, which is essentially omni-channel.
Right.
So I still think the vast majority of shippers are trying to do this the hard way, which is a single or limited carrier model. Trying to leverage some of the tools that they have that are not truly orchestrating to optimize for cost or speed. Um, and we've seen great gains the last few years, but there's still a long ways to go.
That is a great synopsis. It was going to be difficult to get there, so thank you.
I
So,
did one more thing I didn't mention there.
yeah.
The area that we're seeing a lot of innovation it's finally happening is the concept of multimodal orchestration, where you can take a parcel, an array of parcel carriers, regional parcel carriers, et cetera, then take all your last mile courier providers and even LTL providers, an internal fleet, and be able to pick the right mode, the right carrier, the right time, the right place. That's something. If anything's moved post COVID, it's that, and it's orchestrating third party couriers.
So I love that concept, and I don't think that's familiar to all of our listeners. So, can you identify both on your side of things in terms of the shippers you support, Lowe's, for example, where that brings advantages to them, and then where that brings advantages to that end consumer taking the delivery?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, for Lowe's, they had a really successful next day program for a long time. They've had their own fleet in place, and it's worked quite well. For same day, it's a lot more complicated because you essentially have to match supply and demand simultaneously. Because if demand, meaning Lowe's shipping volume outpaces the ability to get couriers, you have a gap and you're going to have upset customers. If you outpace and have too many couriers without enough demand, the couriers have better things to do too. So at the end of the day, there has to be this ratcheting up of supply and demand, and that's what we do. We crowdsource demand from all of our shippers, Advance Auto Parts, Pepsi, Tractor Supply, Lowe's, and then we match it with supply where we've aggregated couriers, and we actually are the carrier. So we're responsible for that delivery. We're responsible for meeting the rate card, and we're also responsible for the SLA. So with that, that's really how we're serving our customers. They don't have to build out a huge team to go procure couriers. We've already done that. We have 1,000 of
Right.
them, and we grow it every week. The other thing they don't have to do is they don't have to staff an exception management team. We can reduce the number of phone calls to the store simply by providing visibility and a good customer experience and by meeting our SLAs. But even so, we have 70 people that are overseeing exceptions for our customers. And that's a
Right.
very small percentage of their deliveries, but it's missing items, et cetera. Wrong address, you have a new house build and the address isn't on the map yet. There's all kinds of things that happen. So all that said, what we're doing is we're making it easy. We're taking the friction away from the internal scale and change management that they need to go through. We're actually bearing some of that burden of change management to enable them to seamlessly execute last mile.
Great. And this point, you mentioned SLAs a few times. You talked about that being the genesis at, a 10-day delivery timeline on an
Yeah.
appliance. And now, same day comes up regularly in what we're talking about here. So, multi-part question here. What is the consumer expectation of delivery timelines, and has that changed in the new normal since COVID? Should shippers be capable of same day, no matter what they're doing, wherever they're doing it, or is that only for specialized sets of products and customers? How do you look at that?
Well, it's almost a trick question, and maybe that's intended because the answer, my answer to that is you have to meet the customer where they are.
Right.
And what that means is you have to be architected to do a 30-minute delivery or a 3-day delivery. And to do that, you have to have the tools, you have to have the technology, you have to have flexible supply in your courier network, and you have to have the ability to architect the SLAs around who your customer is. And if you think about, Advanced Auto Parts, we're doing many 30-minute deliveries every day, tens of thousands of 30-minute deliveries every day. Those are
Right.
deliveries that give them competitive advantage within their pro set, within their pro customers, the customers like repair shops. They need those parts because the car's on the lift and they need to get the customer turned around. Now, if you talk about somebody who's buying a patio set, they may not even be ready for the patio set today. So I think early on there was a false sense of speed. The
Mhm.
speed, was everything. It's not everything. Believe me, I love speed. There's half of a race car hanging behind me. Uh, but speed is not everything. What's everything is having a flexible shipping solution that lets your customer have what they want when they want it.
Okay, I'd buy that. So, what I worry about when it comes to supply, when we talk about this marketplace environment, is that, 4 to 6 weeks at the end of every year. And the old guys have, solved for that by having a supply that's fixed, huge buildings, trucks, planes that can handle that peak day. So, how are we ensuring that level of SLA adherence, that the supply is there to meet the demand in this environment in which supply is completely distributed?
Are you asking from the OneRail perspective or generally?
I think generally, both. So that, like, the peak one, like, maybe take it back a step. Like, what have we noticed about peak the last few years? Is that looking different in the post-COVID world, and how is that being solved for with the new breed parcel carriers like OneRail?
Yeah, so I don't think it's a lot different. I think what you're seeing though is a greater mix. It's not just e-commerce, right? There's more and more stores that are trying to enable same day, visit a store, make a purchase, leave, and have items delivered, right? So it's not just e-com. It's I want to go on a shopping spree and not bring anything home. We see that a lot.
Hmm.
But to answer your question, I think if I'm a retailer specifically, which is downstream, they're getting the last impact from this versus the wholesale channel. I need to have a multi-carrier strategy. I think the biggest mistake that retailers and shippers in general have made are pigeonholing their capacity into one or two couriers or carriers.
Right.
That's the problem. It's if I were to give you $1 million, would you go buy one stock or would it be a mutual fund or some type of risk diversified investment? And that's kind of the way shippers are tending to think now. And it took, I think, some pain and suffering during COVID and even post COVID to realize how important that was.
Yeah, and that was one I was curious about because back the last time I was directly procuring Parcel, I went into this every couple of years RFP process, pit UPS and FedEx against one another. Whoever shaves the most cents gets my business. So what you're suggesting, I'm hearing is the zeitgeist now is that you need to have as many carriers, couriers as possible. And you brought up that 100 courier example. So if you're sitting in a consultancy role for one of these enterprise shippers, is that the right answer? As many as you got enough time to integrate and contract with? Or like, is there a way to think about that for different enterprises that limits the number of relationships they need to establish?
I mean, again, I'm gonna, at the risk of sounding salesy, that's the problem we solve, right? When they
Right.
work with OneRail, they're getting 1,000 integrations. So they simply check the boxes on which ones they want to work with, or they just say, these are the SLAs. This is what I'm comfortable with on cost. Just make it happen, right? So it comes down to where do they want to spend their capital and their strategy bandwidth. You know, if they want to spend it integrating couriers, they can do that all day long. The problem is how do they orchestrate it?
Right.
And that's back to the TMS problem of having a static. So you need two things, right? You need the tech and you need to have some way, and there's multiple solutions out there. I named a few of them that you can use to integrate back in to have a multi-carrier strategy. And I'm never afraid to talk about companies that we compete against because they're also friends. You know, companies like Bring, companies like Delivery Solutions, FarEye. Those are companies that can do this. It's not just OneRail. The thing that we do though is we manage the entire capacity procurement and execution process, and that's just some shippers want to remove more friction than others. Some want to retain that capability, but it's the integrating, and it's getting down to a standard normalized data layer. If you can't do that, it's really tough to execute a proper multi-carrier strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. And going back to the legacy players, then do they still have a place in that strategy? For is there any reason an enterprise shouldn't be doing last mile with USPS, UPS at this point?
So what I've found, sample size of Bill here, but what I've found is if there's like an e-commerce use case where the shipper only has maybe 10 nodes they're shipping from, I think it's a lot easier to solve for because there's a lot of solutions out there where you can get sort of an uh, aggregated parcel capacity. So you're not just depending on UPS or FedEx. There's so many solutions that can do that. But when you start getting into localized delivery, you start talking about 1,000 stores, 5,000 stores, et cetera, 400 warehouses, and you're delivering within concentric circles around those locations, then there's a need to unlock local capacity.
Got it.
And that's
Okay.
where it gets complex. So I think there's a lot off the shelf that you can use to aggregate parcel. There's a lot less off the shelf if you want to truly multimodal or orchestrate multimodally.
Got it. Let's go back to the supply side of that because we talked about how to secure that in detail for the shippers, and the multi-carrier, multi-courier is a big piece of it. But for a carrier or courier, and especially in this environment without, again, the big brown trucks in it, what if you are comfortable sharing some level of the secret sauce? How do you ensure capacity in those peak periods?
Yeah, it's a great question. So our belief, from the day that I kind of thought of OneRail was this is a highly inefficient market, meaning supply and demand is not aligned. And if you think about supply, if you can rationalize that supply is being consumed in silos with no visibility across those silos, that's why they're silos, then you could assume that it's not being orchestrated efficiently. So what we really obsess with is making sure that we have a necessary amount of couriers in our markets to handle almost any load, but at least 10x the load we have right now, and or the demand we have. So the belief system was supply and demand need to be orchestrated. Being an on-demand courier myself, I realized I'm just one little spoke here in somebody's bigger wheel. But the question is, how do you defrag that and get all you can out of it? And that's the secret sauce. It's layering capacity upon capacity, but then having an algorithm to rank it so that you're getting the best capacity, which is a big part of what we're doing, is ranking based on loss runs, on time rates, customer ratings, etc. Average pickup time, not just delivery time.
Loss runs. That's actually, to me personally, something I'm not familiar with. What's that relate to?
Oh, yeah, it's a term I use for claims.
Gotcha.
So
Okay.
damages, lost product. Yeah, it's
Okay.
probably more of an insurance term. They typically refer to it as loss runs.
Gotcha. Okay. So I'm running down some of the names in the space here, and I want to talk a bit about Amazon. It feels like they've been delivering their own packages for years. Obviously, getting into the space where they're now directly competing for market share with the biggest players. Where do you see them in terms of a pure play parcel offering? Do you think they're going to be competing with the names I mentioned and the other couriers, or are they essentially going to act as a 1PL and this is a side business for them? Where do you see them competitively?
So I would find it hard to believe that Amazon wouldn't try to be a parcel carrier. If you look at the play they've been running for 20 years, right? They've continued to ramp up, first starting with third parties and then having a franchise network and then having own trucks and then buying planes. At some point, when you reach enough demand yourself, it certainly does make sense to own your own assets because you can keep them utilized and you can
Right.
control. So that all becomes that elasticity. How is that any different than AWS? Think about that for a second. It's just like AWS. They overbuilt the servers. They only needed that much capacity for during the holiday. Hey, let's sell the servers. Now it's the most profitable part of the business. Why wouldn't they do the same thing? It's essentially cloud for shipping.
Yeah, it's one to keep an eye on for sure.
Hmm.
Continuing to run down the headlines here, we've had a couple of cases where these multi-level e-commerce fulfillment players have either spun off or sold some portion of their fulfillment business. I'm
Hmm.
thinking about Pitney Bowes bankrupting their e-commerce unit. Ship Hero just spun off their fulfillment business. Uh, Being in the space you are, do you have any insight there into what's causing those last mile players to struggle, given
We
the amount of folks entering the space?
we've gained some great talent from what are bad situations, right? So we're grateful for that. But it's unfortunate for some of those companies, and I have a theory on it. I don't know if I'm exactly right or not, but my feeling is even some of the biggest players have overbuilt during the
Mhm.
20 to 22 time period, and they overbuilt for a growth rate that didn't exist. It was certainly a bubble. Um, and I think now anybody that has fixed assets, I think the way to normalize it, is who has fixed assets, warehouses, trucks that you just can't possibly utilize, right? And then that changes the unit economics to a place where maybe you shouldn't even have that business, or maybe you should downsize it tremendously. But that's my opinion on it.
Yeah, and we've seen the same thing from the 1P perspective, and I think this tied in well with that influx of investment in the space. So definitely a bit of an overbuild we're working out of.
Yeah.
Switching back to some of the trends in terms of last mile consumer behavior. We're seeing a lot of the de minimis cross border stuff. The fast fashion retailers like Temu and Shine taking advantage of that to frankly minimize the cost of bringing goods into the states. Has OneRail seen some portion of that? Where do you think? What do you think the overall impact on the last mile space is from these players, or is it minimal?
So we don't have any customers right now that are within that supply chain at any point.
Mhm.
We're not subbing for anybody, and we're not serving them directly. But it's an interesting model, and it's one that's highly disruptive. I haven't really. I'm not really sure, where that goes. I think it really comes back to, does the quality of the product sustain over time? Because ultimately that's anybody that I've talked to, there's those that love it and there's those that don't, right? And
Mhm.
I wanted to try it out. I bought a jacket on Temu, and my wife yelled at me for what a horrible jacket it was. So but then again, I see umpteen articles of clothing showing up in this very same house from Sheen for our 15-year-old daughter. So um, I got yelled at for a jacket. She's allowed to have dresses, but at the end of the day, I do think there's a quality issue, and it's going to really turn into a segment of customer. I think there's still a lot of trial going on. There's a lot of excitement around that model. I think it's a sustainable model. I'm really not sure what it's going to do, long term in terms of impact within the
Yeah.
ecosystem.
There's a recent headline about how it's driving a lot more volume into
Mm.
delivery networks, but from where I sat, like that customer demand was going somewhere. Um,
Yeah.
is it being pulled from Amazon's network? The other thing about you positioning that in terms of customer segmentation is maybe they're pulling more from the TJ Maxx's and discount physical retailers, so that is flow coming out of retail supply chain into e-commerce.
I'll be honest with you. They might be pulling from Goodwill and Salvation Army. I mean, the prices are they're unbelievable prices.
I gotta go shop it. I actually have not gone in there yet.
Yeah, I mean, you could buy stuff for what it costs at the thrift store. It's unbelievable. Yard sales are probably going to be impacted. Like it's a trade-off. You can have something brand new that you throw away after two uses, or you can, you know,
Ooh. So speaking of that kind of treatment of apparel, we haven't really talked of reverse returns, reverse logistics. What's OneRail do there? What do you see that's changing overall in consumer behavior or in how companies are servicing that reverse chain?
yeah, it's a huge factor. I mean, there's been so much time, energy, and effort put into making product go forward, and there hasn't been the same focus on making it go backward. But now it's a matter of sort of brute force, from the P&L saying we got to figure out how to make this go backwards. So we are very small, in terms of our participation in it. We provide returns on products we deliver, but we're not doing anything around the RMA process. We're strictly transportation for reverse logistics. So our
Hmm.
network is like, it can go forward, it can go backward. It's like a automotive transmission. It can go different speeds. But we don't do really anything around being a system of record for returns yet. We do, for us, we see it as a pretty big roadmap item, possibly even an inorganic opportunity. But at the end of the day, returns, there's nobody that's emerged as really the winner of returns yet. Because, first of all,
Interesting.
there's so many different kinds of returns. There's big and bulky returns that are different than apparel returns. There's a lot of progress that's been made. I like what Inmar did with the retail network they built with Kohl's, and they're continuing to build out these networks. I think that's a good way it's a good piece of the puzzle, but
Yeah.
right now, there's like 50 companies that have a piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, you got to put it together. And, I hadn't even thought about it until this point, but for the courier networks, no one's really talked about their empty backhauls because no one
Yeah,
has to pay for it except for the driver themselves. So maybe there's something in that. I don't know.
I think you're onto something there. And then there's the whole re-commerce model. There's some companies that
Hmm,
have they played around with that. That's kind of an interesting idea, but still, it's really hard to make money doing it. So,
right.
uh, yeah, I think there's a lot of chapters to be written there yet.
Right. Well, I'm looking forward to reading them.
Me too.
On let's take it up to a high level here. One piece of advice for two different segments of our listener group. So what I think is true is that the old parcel network design that anyone set up 5 to 10 years ago probably needs a refresh. Whether that's the transportation side, whether that's the physical warehouses and where you deploy inventory. So if you were talking to first a shipper and then a 3PL who supports shippers and has their own facilities assets to do so, what would be your one piece of advice and how they should look at reassessing their parcel last mile supporting network today?
Specifically around parcel.
Yeah, like in the direct to consumer space.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
don't. Yeah.
So we have some customers that I think are on the front edge of that. And what they've done is they've taken parcel shipping out of their DCs and away
Hmm,
from some of their 3PLs. Now, these are retailers, these are bricks and mortar retailers, to
yeah.
provide context. And they've taken it into the store.
Okay.
So, and what they're trying to do is create a seamless fulfillment solution from a bricks and mortar store where that store can be a parcel shipping node And it can also be a fulfill from store, local fulfill from store node. And they want to seamlessly print labels from the same printer, whether it be local, whether it be long distance parcel. They want to be able to service their entire footprint from every store because, I'm sure you're very well aware of the complex inventory and shipping scenarios that are out there. And you may see a small parcel in North Carolina shipped to Minnesota uh, when there's a store right next to the consumer. So there's some logic around inventory and where it needs to be, kind of a natural balancing that's happening by doing that. So at the end of the day, I think it's really unifying parcel and last mile, local last mile out of the same location. At least that's what I'm seeing.
So anything you could think of for the 3PL space, looking at Flex, I represent a network of 2,800 warehouses that put goods into the parcel networks, but themselves aren't operating, carriers, couriers, what have you. So
Right.
is there something that can be done differently from 3PL warehousing today in the States versus 5 years ago to enable these kind of outcomes?
Well, absolutely. I mean, first of all, we're happy to work with Flex. There's a couple opportunities I know that we're working with you on, and we're super excited about that. But I think Flex is a bit different than a lot of the 3PLs that we've seen. First of all, Flex has a lot of nodes, and there's a lot of networks out there, but they don't have that many nodes. And I feel like Flex is architected to handle and execute localized delivery much better than some of the other 3PLs that are out there. So if I'm a retailer, I think Flex would give me an option instead of fulfilling from store. Maybe I could fulfill, if you're in Los Angeles, you have multiple nodes around Los Angeles that are close to customers. I wouldn't need to rely on my stores. Maybe I could offload that burden from the store to the warehouse, to the 3PL. So in the case where there's many nodes, I think that's certainly a great move. But I don't know a lot of 3PLs that have that type of footprint.
Yeah, and it's interesting in that example, pulling inventory out of the stores, but to do that same kind of store based fulfillment. Target had big announcement recently about their sortation center
Yeah.
outside of Detroit, where they're literally doing ship from store out of stores through the sortation center back into the local market. So
Hmm.
it'll be interesting to see how that plays because they went with that in the 1P build it your own fashion.
Yeah.
So here's the fun part. I know I don't want to take too much time. I know we're going over here, so I got a few questions that we're gonna likely drop into like an end of season episode. We
Cool.
do one on predictions, and then we really wanted to focus on AI this year. And then I got the fun question. So I want to put you on the spot here. Crazy bet on 3 years from now, the future of logistics. It can be in this last mile parcel space, or it can be broader than that about supply chain. What do you
Hmm.
think is the biggest thing that looks different 3 years from today?
I think 3 years from today, you'll see a lot less internal fleets.
Hmm.
We see a big shift right now. We just took over a furniture retailer, 400 stores, liquidated their entire fleet because it
Wow.
made more sense to outsource it. And we're seeing a lot of companies that maybe they have 10,000 fleet assets. They'd like to get it down to 8,000 because they're only 30% utilized. So, with some of these advanced orchestration tools and with having kind of elasticity, with now that third party capacity can be orchestrated in conjunction with internal capacity, there's the ability to really deprecate fleets.
Yeah.
And I think that's not a bad thing, right? If I'm a retailer, I need to figure out how I'm going to beat Amazon. I need to figure out how I'm going to beat my closest competitor. I'd rather invest that in strategy and touching the customer, not in trucks.
Right. Yeah, and I'd follow you on that bet. We see the same thing in warehousing and get into these overbuilds
Yeah.
prior. So, yeah, that's a great one. So let's go to AI. We haven't talked about that on this episode. I'm not sure how much you've been involved with it, but I'd love to hear if you see things that are going to be immediately impactful over the next year and the bigger long term impact you'd expect out of that technology specifically.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite topics. First of all, we wouldn't be here without it. When we started, version 1, version point 0.5 of the OneRail platform required a dispatcher. So an order would come in from Menards Home Improvement, our first retailer. We had a dispatcher. They would have to select the market, and they would select which carrier, and they would hit dispatch. And
Hmm.
then hopefully that was a good decision, because if not, it would kick back and then they'd have to do it again. So one head, this was back in 2020, so it wasn't that long ago. One one head could manage 80 deliveries a day. Call it a digital dispatcher.
Okay.
And today, one head manages 3,000 deliveries a day, and there's no dispatch. So what we architected, shortly after that, and we launched it in 2021, was version one, and it's completely machine learning. There's AI being utilized now in our predictive model around supply and demand and pricing. We know if a delivery is going to fail before anything happens. As soon as it comes in, we know if it's going to fail or not. We know for sure. So we about a year ago, probably one of the best decisions I've made is take my original CTO and put him in a role of being head of data science and AI. We built a team around him to optimize transportation. Now we're hiring 3 data scientists to support him even further, because now we're going to start merging our data science with routing, which is super exciting. So I see everybody going that direction. Like I don't know how you can't.
Yeah.
You just yeah, but practical, right? It's I think where AI gets a bad name, every single conference people feel like they have to use the term AI. CNBC has to say it once every 5 minutes. And if you talk to VCs, they're the ones that are really dealing with a lot of BS. They're getting so many AI. Everybody comes up with an idea, but it's not a real
Right.
business. So I'm proud that we've used it practically, and we've used it honestly. We wouldn't even be in business. There's no way we could even do what we do. We'd have 2,200 employees
Yeah.
dispatching orders. We can't do that.
I
So
might bring you back for an AI episode. You've got a lot to say here, and like that kind of a statement, we wouldn't be a business without it, is a grabber right there. Bill, great conversation. I didn't have to ask much. I just sat back, so thank you.
appreciate you thinking of me. Looking forward to talking again soon.